On paper, there is simply no reason for a game like The Binding of Isaac to become as huge as it has. It makes no sense, and this is coming from the person who believed in it the most. You see, The Binding of Isaac was made to clash against mainstream games. It was designed to be a niche hit at best. From any mainstream marketing perspective, I designed Isaac to fail, and that was my goal from the start. The Binding of Isaac has been going strong for a full decade now. It's grown from a bizarre little flash game with a lot of good ideas to one of the most celebrated roguelikes of all time, with spin-offs, merchandise, continued support, and tens of thousands of players every single day. But what exactly has kept it so popular? Is it the replayability, the style, the frantic gameplay? Yes, but you're not here for a flashy intro and a bit of classic video essay prose, are you? You're here for this. And don't worry, we'll get there, but as always, the best place to start is in the beginning.
Isaac and his mother lived alone in a small house on a hill. Isaac kept to himself.
Wait, no, further back, because the beginning of Isaac is the end of Super Meat Boy. After a long and arduous development, Team Meat's first game was met with universal acclaim. Programmer Tommy Reffinez chose to go on vacation in Hawaii, while designer Edmund McMillan had a different idea.
And in the end, the thing that I wanted to do was I want to make something so old school, so like experimental, very risky, very dark, weird game that is as honest as I can make it to who I am as a person. I'm going to talk about, my personal life. I'm going to talk about religious themes and all this other stuff.
Meat Boy had been relatively safe compared to McMillan's earlier works. Sure, there's the domestic abuse and child smothering, but it's no dead baby dress-up. This game was going to harken back to that. Like any creative project, Isaac's design and story were the product of a lot of influences. Games he'd been playing at the time, like Spelunky and Zelda, formed the basis for a roguelike dungeon crawler with a ton of items. Old top-down shooters like Smash TV gave it its faster-paced gameplay, and much like Zelda's setting and storyline took cues from Miyamoto's childhood, Isaac's come from Ed's experience with a religious upbringing. Approaching Florian Himzel, a Flash programmer he'd previously worked with on Triachnid, Coil, and Cunt, The Binding of Isaac was put together in 3 months. One thing Ed brings up in a lot of interviews is his complete lack of confidence in the game.
So I had a direct contact to Steam and I asked him if I could just put it up for cheap. I remember crossing my fingers I felt like I was totally pulling the wool over, like I was taking advantage of Steam here. This is a piece of shit game, using a piece of shit engine.
And who could blame him? The end product was not exactly a top-shelf, well-produced game on the level of Braid or, well, Super Meat Boy. It runs poorly, it looks like the cheap Flash game it is, it deals with abuse and neglect. Most of the story makes no damn sense, and oh god, the religious themes. Think of the controversy, the uproar that could have caused.
Like, my dad visited me after I put the game out, and there was like a retail copy in Germany, and I got a bunch of copies, and he's like, can I have one? I'm like, sure. And he's like, cool. And then comes back and he's like, oh yeah, our church had a lock-in, and he's like, I installed Binding of Isaac on all the computers. And I was like, ah! And he's like, the kids loved it.
Oh. Well, the point is, nobody could have predicted that it would do so well. The game was slapped on Steam for $5 in September of 2011, and by that time, Ed was already moving on to the next project. This fun little experiment left behind to fade away forever.
But just as he accepted his fate, God intervened.
Months after release, the game's sales started to climb. YouTubers flocked to the game like flies to shit. The roguelike elements combined with the many items and the ways they can work together and synergize, packaged in half-hour-long runs, made this the perfect game for Let's Players in the early 2010s. There were people like Northernlion and Uberhaxornova getting hundreds of episodes out of it and never losing interest, slowly spreading it across the platform and helping it reach more and more people. Personally, I found it through Uberhaxornova's Until I Rage series.
I don't want to play anymore!
The support led Ed and Florian to return for a Halloween update that introduced a bit more content to the game, followed by a full-on expansion in 2012 that essentially doubled its size. And the team had plans for even more add-ons, but Adobe Flash just wasn't having it.
It took 3 months to make Isaac, and it took 6+ months to make the expansion, and most of those months were literally spent fixing major bugs and trying to recover corrupted FLA files.
I mean, I get the Adobe pain. I'm sure this video is going to take 3 or 4 tries to render out properly. Fortunately though, at some point after the expansion's release, Edmund was approached by Nicholas to work on a console port, and like an absolute fucking legend, he molded that into one of the sweetest deals I've ever seen in the games industry. The port became a complete overhaul, porting some aspects and remaking others in a different engine, adding all content from Wrath of the Lamb and even more on top of it. Every asset remade, new characters, new bosses, new mechanics, and a framework to add even more at a later date. Leaving Flash behind, it was such a big change, such a massive overhaul, in fact, that you could call it, or Rebirth, but that's not really like a Bible book name. See, we're going for a theme here for the video. I remember when Rebirth was coming out, I already had a couple hundred hours in Wrath of the Lamb, and there was no end to the hype I felt for a complete makeover. I remember the arguments people had over the art style, and quite frankly, all of these mock-ups looked kind of terrible, but once 2014 rolled around and Ed started posting teases and previews on the Isaac blog, there was nothing that could slow my excitement. I remember refreshing the blog every morning and every evening hoping for something new, finding hidden links to even more teases within the posts, and finally staying home from school for a day to play it on release, and the game still surpassed all of my expectations. Then I went through it all over again with the expansions, the teases for Afterbirth and Afterbirth Plus. One of my favorite posts was this one, taking the piss out of Nintendo's past censorship while they were actively porting the game to the 3DS and Wii U, and I was far from the only one excited. The game only grew and grew as the expansions rolled out. Let's Players surpassed 1,000 episodes on YouTube. It was streamed a ton as Twitch grew, and even recently, after Repentance released, the game broke its own record for concurrent players on Steam. It's grown to this massive multi-platform phenomenon, and that's without even mentioning the spin-off for the card game. So, how? How did this game achieve this perfect balance, to a degree where people will spend thousands of hours getting every item, beating every boss with every character, completely exhausting all the game has to offer, and then keep going? Well, let's take a closer look at the way it plays. There are 3 major elements that work together to form Isaac's gameplay: the body, mind, and soul. The body encompasses the surface level, mainly the combat. Isaac has good movement, good shooting, good speed, most of the room layouts are fun and dynamic, and the floors rarely feel too long. The enemies in particular are usually fairly simple in design, but still provide a challenge. A lot of them will naturally swarm and ambush players because of their pathfinding. You can check out this video by Florian Himsel for more on that. He's got a whole series on how the game works, it's pretty cool. Even without all of the randomization, this could be a decent little arcade shooter, but what truly elevates the game are its items. There are 716 items in Isaac now. Most of them are going to impact your run in a meaningful way. Many are simple stat upgrades. There's 2 that give you extra trinket room. A lot of them can help in strange ways, like unlocking rooms when you get hit, and a few change the way you play entirely. Dr. Fetus, Ipecac, and Soy Milk all force you to use your shots differently to attack. The Holy Mantle gives you an extra hit per room. There are familiars who will shoot alongside you, or drop pickups, or throw themselves at enemies. Items that change the speed of the game itself, and that's just scratching the surface. And then there are the active items, which do all kinds of things provided you have the charges. Some of the passive items are dedicated to charging up the active items more easily. The D6, an unlockable starting item for Isaac, allows you to re-roll any item you don't want, and there's like a dozen other dice that re-roll anything else you can think of. And I want to point out some of the newest items added in Repentance for how creative they are. Like Genesis allows you to essentially retry every item and get something better. Book of Virtues gives you a unique familiar for most of the active items. Spin down dice re-rolls items into the one directly below it in the game's internal numbering system. Binge Eater makes every item cycle between what it was going to be and a food item, and eating the food item gives a huge stat boost that slowly decays. Birthright does something different for every character. Member Card opens a second shop within your shop. And Consolation Prize gives you a little boost on your lowest stat. It's nice.
Okay.
Oh, but then we have all the synergies. If you pick up an item that changes how you shoot, and another that also changes how you shoot, there's a good chance that the game has some kind of hard-coded way to make it more powerful. The item Rock Bottom locks all your stats in place and keeps them from decreasing, making Soy Milk one of the best items in the game because it won't lower your damage. There's like a dozen items that just change the way your bombs work, and they can stack to give you bombs that'll kill everything in the room at the same time. One of these is Nancy Bombs, which gives you a random effect from one of the other bomb items whenever you place one. These also interact with Dr. Fetus and Epic Fetus, allowing you to shoot these overpowered bombs everywhere forever. And then beyond these synergies, there's a whole layer of strategy involved in when to even take the items, which brings us to the mind. Isaac forces players to take advantage of everything they have. Pretty basic video game thing, right? Well, Isaac relies heavily on a ton of interlocking systems and resources to a greater degree than most other games. Here's an example. Let's say you're playing as Samson on the 3rd floor. Your goal is to reach Mega Satan, which requires you to get angel deals to blow up the statues and fight the bosses, and you've passed up a devil deal, so you have a guaranteed angel deal chance on this floor as long as you don't take damage to any of your red hearts. There is an exception to this rule for certain self-damaging methods. One of these is the sacrifice room, which you just happen to spawn next to. Because Samson starts with low damage and gains more as he takes damage on the floor, just not getting hit isn't a viable strategy, and any way for the player to control that damage is extremely helpful. Fortunately, after clearing a few rooms, Samson finds the item room containing the super bandage, which grants a red heart container and 2 soul hearts. The smart play here would be to return to the sacrifice room and get Samson's health down a bit before picking the item up. In fact, it might have been a good idea to do this at the start of the floor, depending on how secure the player feels on low health. Now Samson has 2 soul hearts to burn through without losing the angel chance, and extra damage for the rest of the floor. However, using that key to get into the item room means Samson can't get to the shop, which could have a great item like Birthright or Membership Card, assuming the players unlocked them. And if at any point the player uses their only bomb on the floor, they won't be able to get the key piece for Mega Satan at the end. See how that's a lot to keep track of, a lot to know and strategize over without even mentioning the combat itself? Samson is just one of a few characters that inherently treats health like a literal resource to be bought and sold. Same goes for Maggie and Bethany. And these kinds of decisions have to be made on every floor, and it's all randomly generated. Do you want a shop item or should you play the beggar? Try for a secret room or a super secret room? Don't even get me started on what you can pull off with the blank card or blood donation machine in the game. That shit's just crazy. And I mean, yeah, with randomization, you kinda have to take the good with the bad, but that's part of what makes it work. There's a good enough balance in Isaac nowadays that I find myself going into the final boss hopeless and just barely making it through in the end on the majority of runs. The game requires you to manage your resources as efficiently as you can, and gamble on all kinds of unknowns to see if you can help yourself out. Going back to the example, that bomb could have been used for combat, to get to the secret or super secret room, to blow up a tinted rock which can return soul hearts or more bombs or a helpful item. It could be given to a bomb beggar for a chance at some kind of payout, and if you have the right trinket, bombs can be used to open any door that would normally require a key. You're pretty much required to ration all of these resources and stretch everything out to do well in the game, yet it also does a good job of teaching it to you through subtle hints or tutorials. I mean, the resource management here is one of the most important parts of the damn game, and next to nobody talks about it. All of these mechanics and systems also serve to keep the game fresh on every run, which brings us to the soul. Beyond every individual run, the game still has a great progression system. There are hundreds of achievements, and nearly all of them come with some kind of unlock. You can be blowing up tinted rocks for soul hearts, and boom, a small rock has appeared in the basement. From then on, any tinted rock has a chance to pay out with a damage upgrade. After beating moms hard enough times, you open up more paths, in addition to the items you get for beating the final bosses with each character. Unlocking these characters can be as simple as getting a bunch of health in one run, or as complicated as following this ridiculous plan that plays out more like a Call of Duty Zombies Easter egg than a real challenge. The characters add another dimension to the game, changing the way it has to be played, from small adjustments like Kane's higher damage with low tiers and health, to Lilith, who relies entirely on familiars to deal damage. What this all comes together to build is an experience that's fun not only on its own, but elevated by the roguelike elements in a way that plays off of the base mechanics to make it infinitely replayable. The game itself feels like it's opening up to you and growing as you play more, gradually expanding itself so you always have something to do. The randomness of it all makes every run different. It changes the difficulty dynamically. It makes you change how you interact with the game. Your goal is not just to accept the randomness and try to make the best of it, but to influence the random generation itself in a way to force it to give you something good. You have to take back control.
I'm really going into the Binding of Isaac. I structure it in a way that starts out easy enough but doesn't patronize the players. Lets them replay. I keep things short, small, very very similar to Super Meat Boy in the way that, like, I knew going in that I don't want a run to be over 45 minutes to an hour long. If you go 2 hours long, it's just going to feel yucky if you die so far into the game. And keep the trolley more crazy things kind of early so you can feel better about replaying. There's just a lot of complementary things and a lot of unfolding difficulty that scales with your experience that I put a lot of time and effort into, and that's what I think more people should do. It's just, it's not that hard.
And my favorite part about all of this is how seamlessly this gameplay is tied to the storyline. At first, Isaac's storyline looks like some kind of nonsense fever dream. And, well, it might be a fever dream, but it isn't nonsense. Edmund has made the literal story of Isaac very clear. But in those final moments, his imagination and memories come together to form a story. He imagines himself overcoming his mother, confronts his inner demons, he even wonders what might happen to him after he's gone. We get insight into Isaac's life through the game, how he reframes physical abuse as a speed up, or all the magical effects of his mother's pills.
48-hour energy.
It's no coincidence that nearly every enemy or boss in the game resembles Isaac in some way. These are his fears and weaknesses manifest in a way that he can literally overcome. Some of my favorite bits of storytelling in the game are these little cutscenes between floors. There are funny ones, depressing ones, and some that make you question everything you know about the plot. And these are just little distractions you get to see between levels. As the game unfolds, it reveals more to the player as Isaac drills deeper into his own past, unlocking these alternate paths that tell different stories and end in different ways. But at its core, it's the same story playing through his head over and over. Killing his mom, killing himself, wishing he hadn't been born, embracing the evil, going to hell, killing the evil in his mother, fighting back against what he's been taught, embracing it, using faith and evil to try so desperately to cling on to whatever life he has, and in the end, he fails. A lot of Isaac's story is taken from Ed's own childhood. It's ramped up to an extreme that he never encountered, but it's still an incredibly personal story. In interviews, he said that with the exception of some mods made official, every item comes from him to some degree. Magic cards, his cat Guppy, the coat hanger draws from Mommy Dearest, and of course, his religious upbringing. One of my favorite stories he tells in a few interviews is this one.
My grandma used to do a prayer of safe passage. And I clearly remember talking to her about it, and I'm like, what are you doing, when I was little? And she would explain that she's basically telling God to, put a shield around the car so when we go over the hill that we're protected. And I thought that was amazing. My grandma used to cast spells all the time, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I always believed that it was real,
It affected him in such a profound way, and he said that working on Isaac has helped him to see it more clearly.
Make this game about religion that was originally just going to be about the negative aspects of how religion could affect a child, and I kind of came out of it with, if I didn't have religion as a kid, I wouldn't be here, because I wouldn't have this kind of creativity that I pulled from that inspired me as a kid.
It sounds cathartic to him in a way that past projects just weren't. Since Isaac's release, most of Ed's newer games have been that much more personal, and what makes all of this that much more impressive is how perfectly Isaac's presentation works to the game's advantage. When Rebirth was coming out, there were accusations that the use of pixel art as opposed to the hand-drawn look of the original was a mark of laziness, because pixel art was already so common in indie games. Edmund responded that since the game is a homage to all of these old games we talked about earlier, it was fitting for Isaac to look the part. Even back then, he said the Flash game's art was kind of an eyesore, and whenever I try to go back to it, I can't help but agree. That's because Rebirth visuals, especially with the new enhancements and reworks in Repentance, make the game look like the next step after the 16-bit era. It feels nostalgic, like a memory, like an arcade game, well, exactly what the game is. It's also incredibly childish, and easy to recognize as Edmund's design. If this style weren't so carefully balanced, it would probably be one of the most uncomfortable and distressing games ever made. Take a look at any more realistic fan art, and you get something closer to a David Firth cartoon. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I can imagine it being pretty distracting during regular gameplay. Speaking of, the art style is as functional as it is appealing. The enemies and bullets stick out from the background like something from an old cartoon. Small enemies like spiders and flies flash in obnoxious primary colors, and similarly, enemy attacks will flicker to help distinguish them from your own. But while the game may look like a child's imagination, with things like the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse portrayed as bloppy people on wooden horses and Super Mario in the libraries, the music is, well, weird. Flash Isaac's soundtrack, composed by Danny Baranowski, is bizarre. I couldn't tell you what any of these instruments are aside from drums and some electronic things, I think. It fits pretty well. The basement theme is almost whimsical and exploratory with just an edge of sadness. The rest of the floors slowly decay into a hopelessness and misery. Only briefly broken by bouts of action. Only toward the end of a run does this music start to really get overt about the more religious side of the game, presumably as Isaac's death grows nearer. It's a hauntingly beautiful soundtrack in its own right, but Rebirth took an entirely different direction with music by Ridiculon, a heavy metal duo composed of John Evan and Matthias Bossi, who voiced the narrator in both versions of the game. Danny went on to compose Crypt of the Necrodancer and Cadence of Hyrule, and Ridiculon made possibly the best music for any video game ever. It's raw and emotional in a way game soundtracks often struggle to achieve, with every track fitting perfectly with the events it accompanies. That same initial exploration with hints of dread is present in the basement. The depths are almost otherworldly. And Sheol is appropriately hellish. And the feeling that something's watching you in the shop. Oh, but it can go hard when it needs to. You get exactly what you'd want during a battle with fucking Mega Satan. The best part, though, not only for the music, but every aspect of the game, is the final ending added in Repentance. When you walk through the empty halls of the place you called home, reflecting on the life you once had. Isaac sleeps in Mother's bed for comfort, and his nightmare leads to a direct confrontation with the dogma that warped her into a monster. Garbled static and frantic readings of televangelists accompany the battle.
And the blood of Jesus purifies us all from sin. For the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord.
Isaac is taken over entirely, utterly consumed by the dogma. faces the destruction of the world as he knows it, and confronts the beast. And the music for this final battle shifts as it progresses, the fear of famine. The frenetic buzzing of pestilence. The drums of war. The haunting melodies of death itself. And the final confrontation with the pure evil of the beast. Angels sing out as Isaac triumphs over his mother in her most grotesque form, and then it's over. Isaac again reflects on his past, returning briefly to happier memories as the story rewinds and begins anew.
Isaac and his parents lived in a small house on the top of a hill.
The reason I'm making this video really isn't that Isaac is a great game. It is, but so is Super Metroid and Tetris and A Hat in Time. There are so many fantastic games out there today, but Isaac has stuck with me in a way that nothing else has. I admire games like Half-Life or Super Mario 64 as pieces of art, well-crafted entertainment, things I've enjoyed so much that they've stuck with me for most of my life. But I feel a connection to Isaac that I really struggle to put into words. All of these fascinating, disparate elements that come together to tell a story about a kid on his own who enjoys creating and playing in his room, while the darker elements of his mind seep into his art. One time, in middle school art class, I was working on this big Isaac drawing, not even for marks, just because I wanted to. Afterbirth Plus had just released and I couldn't get the imagery out of my mind. It was going to be Delirium, the new final boss, surrounded by a bunch of my favorite items, spiraling out over a backdrop of the Void Portal. After a few days, I was getting pretty far, but the art teacher noticed. I guess the big spooky face and religious symbols freaked her out or something, so she sent me to the counselors to talk about it. From what I remember, they were just kinda confused. I had to leave the art in class when I went home, because it wasn't finished and I didn't want to risk creasing it in my backpack, and after a few more classes, the thing just disappeared. I can't prove shenanigans were at play, but I can't prove they weren't either. I wasn't exposed to religion very much as a kid, but I remember fighting the Four Horsemen in the game and looking up other interpretations of them across history, and that led me to things like the Nephilim and Leviathan, the Beast of Revelation, all of these really cool monsters that have existed for millennia. Don't think I didn't notice Dogma's resemblance to the biblically accurate angels that became a minor meme in the last few years, but I wouldn't have if Isaac hadn't shown me that kind of imagery in the first place. The game has been part of my life for so many years now, I've started to notice things, like how many times Edge tried to get a melee character working.
Originally, Samson was going to have the item that made it so he had melee combat, which we could do because of the range issues in certain rooms. And I can't really figure out an answer for it. It sucks that we can't have a real melee character due to the fact that there are rooms, or lots of rooms, that require you to have range.
Since I found out about this game, I've tried to be there for any major update or expansion, and each time I've gotten sucked back in and played hundreds of hours more, and from what I can tell, Edmonds felt the same way.
It was exactly like Rebirth. Rebirth was just supposed to be a straight up port of the Flash game, and it was like, we could double this. We could double this in size, and why not? So that's what we did.
I'm happy about it.
Basically doubled it in size.
I'm happy about it.
Watching his interviews from the weeks leading up to Repentance, I can feel the excitement he has, both for this final Isaac DLC and all of his future projects. I think Repentance is the perfect capstone for Isaac as we know it. The whole expansion has this finality that wasn't quite there in previous versions, and with modding support, I have no doubt that Isaac will live on for another 10 years. And I'm as excited to see where the game goes as I am to see what its creator comes up with next. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed it. This is by far my biggest project so far in a lot of ways, and I'm super excited to finally get it out there. Let me know what you think in the comments or my Discord server linked below, and thank you so much for watching.
Yeah, so this is Binding of Isaac. I am a huge fan of this game. Hoping I will make tons of freaking levels here. Yeah, tons. Like, I'll play the game a bit. I mean, I'm not going to make levels. There's no level making options. Sorry. Got the Curse of Darkness. Can't see the map. So anyone who's watching this as their first Binding of Isaac video of all time will start this up. See, yeah.